Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we'll be building an app that allows you to upload images and they'll be stored in S3, and then you can fetch those images and display them in the browser. So if I go here and upload a new image, you'll see that it loads, and once it's stored, it refreshes the posts, and you'll see it here. This is also fully responsive, so it'll look nice on mobile, and I'll be using Chakra UI to style the front end. And you also don't need to know anything about AWS S3. I'll be going over the basics, but it's basically just a file storage service which will allow us to store our images. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so I have the starter files open. We just have a button here that doesn't do anything and a section of posts that is empty. So if I open up the code, in the app, we just have the Chakra provider and a container for our app, and then this profile component, which contains this vertical stack, which is this card here, and then the post component. And this is a component that we're going to be changing. So we have the upload button and just posts here. And then we also have an Axios client, and this basically creates an Axios instance with this base URL, which comes from our environment. So you should define your API endpoint. Right now I have it pointing to localhost 4000. And then whenever we use this Axios client, we're always going to be using that base URL, and then we add these headers to every request. And this mimics like an authentication token. You would never want to do this in production, but I just want to keep the video simple. And so that's pretty much it for the front end. And for the back end, it's just a simple Express app with one endpoint defined. And we'll be adding on to this as we need to. So let's go back to the front end and start working on this upload button. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have a hidden input, and when the user clicks on the button, it's going to trigger that input and they'll be able to upload an image file. So let's go ahead and create that input. So we'll import that from Chakra, and then we want to add some properties to it. So we want to first give it an ID, and that'll be image input. And then we also want to give it a type, and that'll be of type file. We want to make sure it's hidden so that it's not displayed to the user, and then we want to give it an onChange handler. And let's come up here and just define that really quick. And this is just going to log the event. Then we'll use that in here. And then for the button, since we want it to be hooked up to the input, we can use the HTML4 prop. Let's actually give it the as prop, and we're going to tell them that we want it to display as a label, and then it'll allow us to do the HTML4 prop. And we want to use the ID for the input. So let's just copy that over. So now this is basically saying that we want to display a button, but we want it to be a label, and we want to hook up the label to this input by this ID. And so if we come back to our app and we open up the console, I'll zoom in for it, and then we hit this upload button, it'll trigger that file input type, and then we could upload an image. And then we see the event here. So we'll be able to grab the file off of it. So let's go back here in our handler and let's grab the file. We can get the file that was passed by accessing the event. So we can do const file equals event.target.files. And then this will be an array of files that the user passed in. In our case, it'll just be one item. So we want to grab that first one. And now we have our file. And so now if I just log the file to the console, we'll be able to see that. So come back here, clear the console, and upload the image again. I think I just need to refresh, and I'll try to re-upload that. And now we see the file. And this file object just has some properties about it, like the name and the size and image type. Now in our handler, we want to do some basic validation. So let's create an array up here of valid file types. So we could do const valid file types is equal to an array. And then I'm just going to paste in some file types. So we want to only accept these files. So down here, we can come and check if that file type is in this array. So we'll do if, and then we want to look at the file, the valid file types, and we're going to try to find the file type that was passed in. And so we're going to call the find method on the valid file types. And for each type, we want to check if that type is equal to the file here that was passed in. So we'll do file.type because that's the property down here. And we want to check if it's not there. So if it doesn't find the file type of the file that was passed in this array, then we want to return an error. So let's create some error state first. We'll just call it error, and it'll be an empty string to start with. And then we also need to import that from React. And now in here, we want to call the set error, and then we'll just pass in a message like file must be JPEG or PNG format. And then we want to return out of the function so that we don't continue on. And now we also want to display that error message down here. So we'll go right below the upload button and do a check. So we'll check if error exists, and if it does, then we want to output some text, and that's going to come from Chakra, and then we just want to output the error. And I want to add some props to this text. So I'll just copy those over. So now if we hit save and we try to upload a file that's not one of those valid file types, like a JSON file, then you'll see that the error message is displayed because the file type is JSON. So that validation is working. Now the next thing we want to do is take that file and post it to the API. So the way we do that is we need to create a HTML form data object. Then we could append the file that was passed to the form data, and then we just post the form data to the backend. We can just start by creating that form data object, and this is built in, so you don't need to import anything. And then once we have this form data object, we can call the append method, and we need to give it a key. So we'll just call it image and then the value. And in our case, it's the file that was passed in. So once we have this, all we need to do is post this form to our API. Well, I'm going to create a custom hook for posting data. So let's create a folder called hooks. And then in here, we'll create a file called use mutation. So mutation is usually when you're posting or changing data. In here, we want to create a React component. So we'll do const use mutation. It's equal to a function. And this function is going to take some parameters. And we want the URL and the method. And if the user doesn't pass in a method, we want to default it to post. So in here, we want to create some state. And I'm just going to copy that over. And we also need to import that from React. So our state is just going to be an object with an isLoading and error properties. And then we first want to return that state so that when we use the component, we'll have access to it. And now the way that this hook's going to work is we're going to define a function and return that function here. And then when the user calls that function in the other components, it's going to take care of making the API request and updating this state. And all of this is going to be abstracted away in this use mutation hook, so the front end would not have to deal with it. So let's create that function. So we could do const fn, you could name it whatever you want, and it's going to be async, and it's going to take some data. And this is the data that you're going to want to post. So then within this function, we first want to set the state to tell the user that it's loading. So we want to get the previous state and return a new object with the previous state spreaded, and then we want to set is loading to true. So now that we have that loading state, we can make the API request. So we want to import our Axios client, and I think I just need to open it up and then it'll auto import. There we go. And then in here, we want to pass in the URL, and this is just the config for Axios. So as the URL property, the method, and then the data. These two properties will be the ones passed into the use mutation, and then the function we return is going to take a new parameter, this data, and that'll get passed to the Axios client. And then we want to just call the then catch, so we can catch any errors. And in the then block, this will be called when it's a successful request. And so in here, we could just call set state, and then we want to set is loading to false and error to an empty string if it was previously an error. And then if there was an error, we want to do the same thing except set the error property. So we'll just copy that, is loading will be false, and then the error will be equal to the error that was caught here. Okay, so now that we've defined this function, we need to return it. We'll just call it mutate and then pass in the function. And then we want to spread the state. So now anytime that we call this use mutation hook, we're going to pass in some parameters, and then it's going to return this mutate function. And then we're going to take that mutate function, and whenever we want to post data, it'll run this chunk of code here. And it'll set the loading state, make the API request, and then when it's either successful or error response, we'll set that state in here. So now in the other components, we could just use this mutate and have access to the state. Let's go ahead and export use mutation. And now we can come back in our post here and call it. And we want to destructure the properties from there. So we'll call use mutation. And then in here, we want to pass those parameters. So the URL and the method. And I'm going to create a constant for the URL here because we're going to reuse that. And it'll be /images. And we'll make this endpoint in the API eventually. And so URL will be equal to URL. And then we're not going to pass a method because we'll just use the default of post. So now we can destructure the mutate function, and we'll just rename it to upload image. And then the other properties. So is loading, and we'll rename that to uploading. And then we want to get the error, and we'll just rename that to upload error. Now we have access to the function and the state all handled by this use mutation hook. So now all we need to do is call this upload image at the end here once we've created the form. So we'll just do await upload image, and then the data we want to pass in is that form. And we need to turn this into an async function. And now when we call upload image, we're passing in that form. And so that's basically calling this function with this data. And so our data will be that form. So if I go back here to the front end and open up the network tab, let me just refresh. When I go to upload an image and I select a valid image type, you'll see in the network, you'll see that request. And you see it was a post request, it's a /images. And if I look at the payload, you'll see that it's form data, which is good. It's exactly what we wanted. But it returns 404 because we haven't defined that endpoint here. Before we make the API endpoint, I want to go back to the post and add the loading and error states for the upload. So we'll take uploading, and then on the button, we want to pass the isLoading prop. And whenever this isLoading prop is true, it'll display a loading state. So we want to make it equal to uploading. So when uploading is true, the button will be displayed in a loading state. And then we also want to add the error text, but instead of just copy and pasting this, I want to create an error text component, which is just going to be more reusable. So I'll just come up here and create that component here. So the error text component is just going to take the children and any other props and output this text component with the font size and color and just output the children. Because this size and color is going to be reused. And so down here, instead of displaying text, we'll display error text. And then we just want to copy this and handle the upload error. We'll just paste that in there. And now we can get rid of these props, and they should all look the same. And we actually need to put this as the upload error. And then in our use mutation, we need to set this error to the error.message because we just want that text string, not the entire error object itself. So now if we hit save and we refresh, you'll see that when you try to upload an image, you'll see the error text here. So that's all working good. And now let's create that API endpoint. So let's come in here and change this to a post request, and it'll be to /images. And then we're going to be using Molter to parse the images from the request. And it makes it really easy to grab it. And in order to use it, we need to create a constant up here, and we'll call it upload. And then it's going to be equal to Molter, and we're going to invoke it. And then in here, we can pass some options. One of them is storage. So let's create that storage variable up here. So we'll do const storage, and we're going to call another method that comes from Molter, and it's called memory storage. And we're going to invoke that. And this basically allows you to store the image that was uploaded in memory so we can then upload it to S3. We could also pass in a destination if we wanted to save the file somewhere in our local directory, but we don't want to do that. We're going to store it on S3. Now that we have this, we can call this upload middleware. And so we just put it in front of our request handler, and we want to call the single method. This basically will parse a single file from the request. If we have multiple files, then we need to call the other methods. And then in here, as a parameter, we need to pass the name for the file that we're passing in. So in our case, if we look at our front end on the form, we're calling the key image. And so that's what we have to pass in here. So Molter is going to look at the form data for this key in order to try to parse the file. And if it finds it, then it'll add the file to the request object here so that in our handler, we can then get access to the file that was passed. So we can come here and just log the file, and I want to grab a couple of other things. So in here, I'm grabbing the file off of the request object, and then I'm also grabbing the user ID from the headers, and that's where we're setting this in the Axios client. And then I'm also just doing a small check, like if there's no file or user ID, then return a 400, which is bad request. And then I also want to log the file just to show you guys what that looks like. So now let's open up and clear the console. Now, if we upload a file, we should see that on the backend. And there it is. So you could see the field name, which was image, the original name, image2, and here's the buffer. This buffer is what we're actually going to send to S3, and then S3 will store this image. You can also set some file validation on Molter, and that would be a good practice, but just for the sake of time, I'm not going to do it. You could pass it in here, file filter, and then pass in a function that will filter based on the file type that was passed in. But we're not going to do that for now, but you would want to do that in production. So now we need to upload that file to S3. And to get started, you should log into your AWS console, and if you don't have an account, create one, and then head over to S3. You're going to want to click Create Bucket, give the bucket a name. So I'm just going to paste this one in because that's what's in my env file here. And then you could basically leave all these default values and just click Create Bucket. And now that we have the bucket created, we're basically going to store each image under the prefix of the user ID and then the image name. In the bucket, we're going to have files with like user123 and then the file name. Let's create our S3 client, and we come in here and do S3. And the way that the S3 SDK works is you create an S3 client, and then you could call the send method passing in different commands. So let's start by grabbing the bucket and creating the client. So we can import that from the SDK. And then let's create a function called upload to S3. And in here, we're going to take some parameters, and that'll be the file and the user ID. And then here we want to define the object that we want to upload. So first, let's give it a key. So we'll do const key equals, and then I'm just going to generate a random UUID. But first, we want to give that user ID prefix. So we're going to use template strings here and do the user ID / and then we need to generate the UUID. So I'll just call that. Then we're just going to import that from the UUID package. Okay, so now that we have this key, it's going to be a user ID and some random generated ID. And now we need to create the command for the S3 client. The command we want is the PutObject command because we're putting or adding an object to our bucket. So we'll do const command equals, we're going to call new PutObject command. So that comes from the S3 SDK. And then in here, we want to pass in an object. The bucket is required. So we need to do bucket, and we'll set it equal to the bucket in our environment. So up here, we also need to give it a key. So we'll do key. We'll set that equal to the key that was generated up here. And then we also want to pass in a body, and this will be the file body. So we'll do body, and we want that to be equal to the file.buffer. Because we want this stream of binary data, we want that to be the actual content of the file that gets stored. And then lastly, we could give it a content type. And the content type will be the file dot, and then we want the MIME type property because that has the file type. Okay, so now that we have this command, all we need to do is call the send method on the S3 client, and then that will send the request. So in here, we could put the command, and we want to wrap this in a try catch because it'll throw an error if something goes wrong. And so we want to catch that error. We want to also log it to the console, and then we'll just return an object with that error property set. And then we'll use that in the handler to check for errors. So we'll try to await this. If this was successful, then we just want to return the key, and we'll eventually return that back to the front end. So now let's export this and use it in our handler. So after doing the validation, we'll call that method or function, and we want to import that. And then we need to pass in the necessary things, so the file and the user ID. And we're already checking that they exist, so we don't need to do that in here. And then this function returns either an error or the key. And we want to check if there was an error. And we'll just return a 500 if there was. And I'm just going to paste that in real quick. So if there was an error, return a 500 with the error message. If there was no error, we just want to return the key of the object that was created. And we're not actually using this, but it may be helpful in the future. Now that we have all this, we can remove that log. And if we go back to the front end and upload an image, we should be able to see that in S3. So we'll do image 1, upload it, and there was an error. So let's see. Okay, so looks like we're getting an import error. This has to be module. Yeah, I didn't do the correct file type. Okay. So now this should all work. And there's actually one more thing we need to do. In order for the S3 SDK to work, you need to tell it which credentials to use. So if you've never set up AWS credentials, then you should look up how to do that. And I'll leave a link in the description, but it basically configures different credentials for your different AWS accounts on your machine at this directory. So at your root and then in the .aws folder. So if you open this up, you'll see all your profiles in here. So you could see that there's a default profile, and then there's this named profile. And these keys are fake, but in your case, they would be your actual access keys and secrets. And so in order to tell the SDK which profile to use, you can go in the env and either set this AWS profile variable, and the SDK automatically checks for this, and then you could pass in the profile name. So you could pass in this, or if you just leave this out, then the SDK will just use the default on your machine. But if you have no default profile defined and you didn't specify another profile, then the SDK will throw an error saying that it couldn't find credentials. So you want to make sure that you set up your AWS credentials and you either use the profile here or just use the default, which is what I'm going to do. You want to make sure you restart the server once you've added those, and the SDK should work. All right, so let's start this back up. Let's close this out. And now when we upload the image, it should get stored in S3. So let's do image 1 and see the loading state. And then if we refresh our bucket, you'll see 1, 2, 3. That's the user ID. And then this was the randomly generated ID. And if we open this up, we see that photo that was uploaded. So now that everything's uploading successfully, we should let the user know that the upload was successful because there is nothing displayed to them. So let's go back into the use mutation. And here on the API request, when it's successful, we want to add a toast to let them know that everything went well. So let's actually come up here and create the toast. So we'll do const toast equals use toast. And that comes from Chakra. This returns a function that we can invoke and configure the toast with. So let's come up here, and after we set the state, we want to invoke the toast. And then in here, we could pass all these options. I'm just going to paste in the options. So we want the title to be successfully added image. We want the status to be success, so it's green. And we want it for 2 seconds, and the position will be at the top. We save this, and we come back here, and we try to upload an image. I'll do image 2. We should see successfully added image. And then that again is stored here. Now we need to work on fetching those posts. Let's go back to the front end and create another hook, and we'll call it use query. So let's define it here. And again, it's going to be a function, and it's going to take a URL as a parameter. In here, we want to define some state again. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in, and then import that at the top. And then we're going to want to return that state. inside of this use query, we want to run a use effect. And so that's going to run right when the component renders. Let's call use effect. And in here, we're going to pass a function. And then let's create the dependency array. So this will only run once when the component renders, and then whenever the URL changes. And that's what we pass in here. And so inside the use effect, we want to define an async function. We'll just do fetch equals an async function. After we define it, we're just going to want to call it here. So that when the component renders, it creates this fetch function and then just calls it. And this fetch function is where we're going to actually make the API call. Let's bring in the Axios client, and then we're going to want to call the get method on the client. And then we just need to pass in the URL. And since it's a get request, it doesn't need any more parameters. So then again, let's tack on the then catch blocks. And in here, we're going to get the Axios result. And on that result is going to be a data property. So let's just destructure the data. And then we want to call set state. We're going to set the data, and that'll be equal to the data that we destructured, and then set is loading to false and error to an empty string. So very similar to the other hook. And here, we're going to want to catch the error. If there was any, just call set state again. And this time data will be null because there was an error, is loading will be false, and then the error we want to be the error.message. Okay, so now that we have this call here, we'll be able to access the data and the loading state and error state from other components. So let's just export this. And now we'll come back to our post component and let's use it up here. So we'll do const, we'll call use query. Okay, now in here, we need to pass in the URL and we'll get access to the different properties it returns. So again, we're going to have data, and this is going to be equal to the image URLs. That'll make more sense later. And we're just going to default it to an empty array. And then we want to get the loading state, and this will be renamed to images loading, and then the error, and that will be called fetch error. We should also display the error down here. So we're going to check if there was a fetch error, and if there was, we're going to use the error text, and then we don't need these properties, but we want them to be text align left. And you remember we're spreading the properties up here, or we should be. Okay, so now it'll be text align left, and there's our error message. Now we also need to add the loading state. Let's take images loading. And then we'll check here if the images are loading, we want to output circular progress. And then I'm going to paste in some properties. So just setting the colors and size and all of that. If we just set this to true, you'll be able to see that loading spinner there. So that's all working as expected. So we'll set this back to images loading. Okay, now let's deal with this error and create that API request. So let's go back to the API. And before we define the new route, I want to explain how this is all going to work. So when you upload an image to an S3 bucket, you can view that image by just clicking on it and then clicking open here. And you can see here that there's this URL here, and this is an AWS signed URL. So it has a bunch of query parameters like the Amazon signature and the ID and a couple other things. So you can take this URL and you can view it. But this assigned URL expires and the default is 15 minutes. If you remember this bucket, we turned off the public access to it. So if you come here, block public access is on, but here we are viewing the image publicly. And that's because of this pre-signed URL. So pre-signed URLs allow a user or a client to temporarily have access to an object in a bucket in one that they normally would not have access to. And it's only for a short amount of time. And so what we need to do is create pre-signed URLs for all of the images in this bucket and then return those URLs to the front end. And that front end will then create images with the sources being those pre-signed URLs. With all that in mind, let's come back and create the handler. So we'll do app.get and it'll be to /images. We want it to be async. And then we don't need the file anymore. We do want the user ID, And we just remove all that stuff. Well, we could actually check for the user ID. Okay, so now let's create a function that will retrieve all those pre-signed URLs. So let's come back to the S3 file here. And the first thing that we need to do is get all of the keys for the objects that we need to create pre-signed URLs for. So the first thing we need to do is create a function that will get all of the keys that we need in order to generate the pre-signed URLs. So we're only going to generate URLs for the keys that we find. And we want to get all of the keys under this user ID, 123. So let's create a function here called getImageKeysByUser. And this is going to be an async function. It's going to take in a user ID. And then the AWS SDK gives us the list objects v2 command. And that basically allows us to list all the objects by a specific prefix in a bucket. So I'm just going to copy that command. And it works the same way, where we call new list objects v2. And we need to import this at the top. And so it's going to take a bucket, and I'm going to pass in the bucket, and the prefix will be the user ID. So it's going to tell the SDK that we want to get all the objects under the user ID prefix. So it'll be under 123 in our case. So it'll get all of these objects. We need to call the send method. Make it equal to client or s3.send. And then we want to pass in that command that we just created. And so this list objects v2 command returns an array with some properties, or an object. And the ones we want are the contents. And this is going to be an array of all the objects that were found. So if there's no objects, it's going to be null. So we want to just default it to an empty array. And now that we have these contents, we want to map through them and get all of the keys from them. So we'll just call return. We're going to take the contents and map through each one. For each image, we're going to want to return the image.key. So on the image that's returned, you get all these properties like the key of the image, the size, and all these things. So we want the key. So now at the end of this call, we're basically just going to get an array of all the keys that we need to generate pre-signed URLs for. So let's export a new function called getUserPresignedURLs. This is also going to be async, and it'll take a user ID. And now in here, we want to wrap everything in a try catch so that we could catch any AWS errors. And the first thing we want to do is call this function. We'll do const keys, or image keys, and we want it to be equal to getImageKeysByUser. And then we want to pass in that user ID. So now image keys will be an array of all the keys. If there was an error, we want to log it. And then also just return that object with the error set on it. So now that we have these image keys, we want to generate a pre-signed URL for each key. And the way we do that is by using the getSignedURL function, and that comes from the S3 request presigner SDK. So that should be auto imported, and you could see as the parameters, we pass in the client. So that'll be S3, and then a command here. So we'll just leave that for now. And then lastly, an options object. This has different properties like expires in, and this is the number of seconds. The default is 900. So if you guys want to increase it or decrease it, it's up to you. I'll just leave it at the default. Now we need to create the command. So this command basically tells this getSignedURL function what it needs to run in order to get the object that you want to pre-sign. I'm just going to copy what we did above, and we'll do a getObject command. We pass in the bucket and the key. That's going to get that object, and then it's basically going to generate the pre-signed URL. So we need to do this logic for every single key in the array. Let's take the image keys, and we're going to map through them. And then for each key, we want to do this logic. And now this key will be passed in for the current key in the array. We want to return this. Now this image keys map function returns an array. So let's just capture that, and we'll do pre-signed URLs, make it equal to the output of the map function. And so the map function basically loops through each item in an array and returns a new array with the output of this function that's passed in. And so we take every key, we create a command to get that key from the bucket, and then we generate a pre-signed URL using that command. So what eventually gets returned is the output of this function. And the output of this function is a string, which would be the pre-signed URL. In order to get all the pre-signed URLs, we could just wrap everything in a promise.all. And you can see here that the promise.all creates a promise that is resolved with an array of results when all the provided promises resolve or reject. So we'll just copy this into the promise.all. Now this is going to be an array of promises. And there's some syntax that I'm missing a parenthesis. So now these pre-signed URLs, it's going to eventually resolve to an array of strings here. I hope that makes sense. Now that we have these pre-signed URLs, we can just return them. So we'll do a return. So we can come back to our handler and we can destructure the properties that it returns. So let's call it here, and we need to pass in the user ID again. And now in here, we're either going to get an error or the pre-signed URLs. And then we want to check if there was an error. And if there was, then we'll just do a 400. And then we want to return the pre-signed URLs. So now this endpoint should return an array of strings, and those strings are going to be the pre-signed URLs. Let's go back to our browser and just refresh. If we open up the network tab, we should see a get request to images, and I think we missed an await somewhere. So, oh yeah, we need to await that. And then in here, we also need to await these promises. Okay, so now if we come back here and refresh, we should see those images, and here they are. It's an array with those two links. And now if we just copy the value here and we open up the image in a browser, we get to see it here. So now that we get this array returned, we can output images using these links. So let's go back to the posts here. We have our image URLs here. So let's come down and we're going to use a simple grid to display them. In here, we can define some columns. And in Chakra, in order to pass responsive values in, you could pass in an array, and then each value will correspond to the screen size. So on the smallest screen size, we want one column, meaning it'll take up the entire container. And then on small or medium, we want two. Everything above that, we want 3 columns. We also want to give it some spacing. So we'll do spacing equal to 4. And now in here, we want to output all the images. Let's take the image URLs and we want to map through each one. For each URL, we want to output an image. So we'll use the image from Chakra. And in here for the source, we're going to set that equal to the URL. The key will also just be the URL because that's unique. And then we'll just give it an alt of image. Okay, so now if we hit save, we should see those images pop up here. And there they are. And the app is crashing for some reason. And I think we just need a question mark here. So it checks if image URLs are defined, and if they are, then map through all of them. So now if we refresh, we'll see the images and there are no errors. We also want to handle when a user doesn't have any images. I'm just going to copy this in. So we're going to check if there's no error and the image URL's length is 0, then we're going to just output no images found. And this isn't going to be error text. This will just be grayed out. In here, we actually want to check if the image URL length is greater than 0. Then we'll map through and we don't need this question mark anymore. So now it all works. And then I also want to add a border radius to the images just to style them a bit. So now if we upload an image, let's do image 3. It was successfully added, but it doesn't display here until we actually refresh. So let's trigger a refetch when someone uploads an image. The way we're going to do that is we need to add something to the useQuery hook. We need to add another dependency to this useEffect call. So we'll take in a second parameter here. We'll call it refetch, and then we'll pass that to the dependency array. So now anytime that the URL or refetch changes, it's going to rerun the useEffect and then rerun this fetch, which will get the data and set it in the state. So now that we're passing that, we can go back to the posts and we need to set some state for the refetch. because we need to know when we want to refetch. Let's just create some state here. We'll call it refetch, and then it's going to start at 0. We're also going to pass this refetch into the use query as the second parameter. And now, anytime we want to refetch the query down here, we just need to change this variable. So right here in our handle upload, we can call set refetch, and then we'll take the state and return state plus 1. So it'll be 0, and then when this uploads, we set the refetch to 1 higher. So then when it comes to the use query hook, 1 is obviously different than 0, so it'll trigger the refetch. The other thing to note with S3, when we upload the image, there is still some time where the image isn't fully accessible. And so when you upload it, if we trigger the refetch right away, we won't actually get that image in the results. So we need to actually set like a timeout. Let's add that. So in this timeout, we're just going to run a function that calls set refetch after 1 second. So once we've uploaded the image, we're going to wait a second and then call set refetch, which will then trigger refetching. We should see that being displayed here with all the new images. So we have 3 images now. I'll upload image 4. So it waits a second and then it'll refetch. But you can see here, image 4 was just added here instead of at the top. And the reason for that is by default, when we get all the images, these contents are not sorted, or they're sorted rather by the key, not by the date. And so we need to manually sort them because S3 doesn't provide a way to fetch them sorting by the date. So let's just call the sort method. In here, I'm just going to paste in a handy sort function that will sort everything to have the latest object be first. So if I save that and we refresh, we should see that this image was the most recent one, and that appears first. If I go and upload image 5, you should see that it gets uploaded and then it displays first. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already. It would help me out a ton. And let me know in the comments if you have any questions or what you guys want to see next. So thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.